the Shadow Defence Secretary, James Cartlidge, who's here with me. A very good morning to you. Had a discussion with Luke Pollard from the Defence Ministry an hour ago. I'll start with where I started with him. Does the Conservative Party, do you support or are you disappointed by the action that the US took over the weekend?
Support.
Explain why.
Well, actually, as I said last week, I think on your show, that we took the view that, in principle, because of the nature of the threat of Iran obtaining nuclear weapons, if the US and Israel felt on the basis of the intelligence that they needed to launch decisive action, we would support it. And I stand by that.
If you look at the assessment of what's happened, it's too early to say whether really the nuclear capability has been obliterated?
Well, I think it's certainly too early for us to make detailed judgment. We're not obviously privy to the intelligence, as it were. I think you can see some open source, and you've obviously the President has used his unique language to describe what's happened. I think we all know the potential of these weapons that were dropped and built in many ways for this sort of situation, so they will have had significant impact. But yes, too early to say definitively exactly what impact it's had on Iran's ability to enrich.
Can you understand the government's position of not being as forthright as you are today to say that you support it, that perhaps it's something that's easier for you to say in opposition than in government? Is that fair?
No, I don't agree with that. I mean, to be fair, if you look at what the Prime Minister said, he was clear that he sees the threat of Iran having nuclear weapons. I think the point is many other politicians, many other countries have said they don't want that outcome, but many have said, well, it has to be diplomacy. But you reach a point of saying, what if that doesn't deliver that outcome? So, none of us want to see military action. In many ways, it's a last resort. But for us, it's always been clear, Kemi Badenoch has said this right from the outset, we don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. If you really feel that, and given how serious the threat is, ultimately you have to be prepared to take military action.
But it seems to me that the arguments in favour of military action, give or take, probably have existed for quite some time. And the trigger of the action in the short term is really two things. Weakness of Iranian positions so that the attacks would be more successful, and Israel forcing the West's hands. I mean, in that sense, that's not really a legitimate explanation in the short term for why we as a nation, or the US as an allied nation, should take the action. Is that fair?
Well, whether it's a legal argument, if one was to say that, if your goal is to denude Iran of this capacity and you think you can do it with relatively low side effect in terms of civilian casualties or whatever, then that's not an unreasonable argument, but it's not the primary one. The primary one must be about self-defence. That's the legal argument in terms of Israel. And I think we did see, to be fair, recently a report from the Atomic Energy Inspector saying that the level of enrichment was very high, way beyond what they would expect from a non-publicly nuclear-armed state, as it were. So I think there is that factor. But let's be honest, we sitting here do not know what the exact intelligence would have said. I take the view, we've seen the impact with our own eyes of what Iran is capable of. I make the point repeatedly that, in the Red Sea, when the Houthis were attacking, they attacked our own navy with missiles and drones. These would have been supplied by Iran. And my view is that a country prepared to do that, if it was to get hold of nuclear weapons, it's such a terrible outcome that we have to be prepared to take this action.
But just on that point, and then we'll move on in terms of what the UK government is and isn't saying at this moment. You're saying for the UK, for example, to either support this action or have been involved themselves, we have to be directly threatened in order for that to be the position. And if you and I aren't specifically up to speed on the precise details of the intelligence, maybe it's fair to say Israel was, maybe it's fair to say the US was. But if we weren't, and the intelligence doesn't say that, presumably it's fair to say that the government here shouldn't have been involved until that moment is met?
I don't agree, because, look, I'm not a, if you like, expert in international law. I do understand that legal arguments about self-defence and the imminence of threat and so on, but ultimately you do have to make these judgments in the round about your ultimate public interest. I think from a UK point of view, the threat of Iran obtaining nuclear weapons is a threat to us, but also to our allies. And to your question, I think it's actually specifically the case in international law that it can be coming to the defence of an ally, not just a direct threat to yourself. So I think when you consider the intensity of the nature of the threat to Israel, which is an ally of the United Kingdom, where the regime have threatened to wipe them off the face of the earth, that is a key factor. but also the United States is our closest military ally. So we support our allies in this because the threat is one that is shared with ourselves. It may be most intense for Israel, but I referred to what happened in the Red Sea. We see this as a threat to the United Kingdom.
Does it make you uncomfortable to see the suggestion over the last 12 to 16 hours from President Trump on his social media that regime change might be a goal here, or is that a legitimate goal?
Well, that's certainly something I haven't spoken about, or Kemi Badenoch or other Conservatives for that matter. Our focus has been on the threat, the nuclear weapons programme. It's not for me to comment on anything the President has said. That's his policy.
But that's the same defence that Luke Pollard used, which is it's relevant to our country, so it's relevant to ask you your view. I mean, if regime change has ever been the goal, would that make this action illegal?
It's not been our goal. I think that we were very clear. The focus was on not allowing Iran to have an effective nuclear weapons programme. That was very much the focus. That remains the case. That's why we think this was justified. And, you know, by the way, I think there will be people watching this who think to themselves, well, hold on, you've done that. Isn't there now a risk of reprisal or whatever? I think another key point to communicate is if you think, as I think most key people do, including the Prime Minister, if you think that Iran can't be allowed to have nuclear weapons, you have to understand there is no risk-free way of dealing with that. If you did nothing, you'd be taking a risk, arguably, because they would, you know, continue down the road of their programme.
If the US, for whatever reason, and things can happen, you know, in unplanned ways in the coming days or weeks, deepens its involvement with Iran, should we back them? Should we get involved ourselves?
I wouldn't want to be drawn into speculation on what might happen. I think that the steps I want to see immediately, if you like, the most important one is that on Friday we had a very serious incursion of one of our most important military bases, RAF Brize Norton, damage to aircraft that are important to our military. We also had this arrest in Cyprus, where we have RAF Akrotiri, incredibly important RAF base for the Middle East. Given that, a key thing I want to see immediately is the government confirming that they are shoring up security around our military bases, both at home and abroad.
Which I guess is a sort of unrelated but important point, and the government did.
Well, just because you asked me about, if you like, what steps could be taken next, for me, that is the critical one.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just let's round off on that point. No one underestimates the significance of the fact that a base here was able to be broken into so easily. Is it right to use terrorism laws to respond to that rather than the rest of the legal structure? They clearly broke in. It's a military base. It's embarrassing for us. There's no doubt about that. But is it right to prescribe them?
I agree with that. I think it's very serious indeed. It's not just the sabotage, which is...
So you agree, you think they should be prescribed?
Yes, I do. I think that just the seriousness of this is, remember what happened recently. You know, the Ukrainians were able to destroy Russian planes on the ground. If you look at the way war is changing the use of drones, we have got to better protect our bases. And part of that is not just, if you like, physical security, you know, the fencing, the wires, you know, any electronic security or even use of counter-drone measures. Actually, if you have a deterrent through the law showing that people who do this will be dealt with appropriately, that is also a key part of your security.
James Cartlidge, thanks for joining us. Good to see you this morning.